Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has just joined. A very warm welcome to the webinar session on how young people influence policy. It's really nice to see so many people have joined already, and hopefully it will be even more during the webinar. Just to formally note that the webinar is currently being recorded, so that everyone is aware of that, and also it will be made available, of course, afterwards, so that we can share it more widely with those who were not able to participate today. A very quick overview, if we can have the next slide, on the exact agenda for the webinar. So we have a total of 1 hour and a half planned for the webinar. It is divided in 3 parts. We will start, of course, with a brief introduction, after which we will go into the main part of the webinar, which is the academic literature review, which will be presented by Daniel Shepard, who has conducted the review for us. He will present his findings, after which we will go into a Q&A session where everyone can ask their questions to Daniel. The second part is reflection on these findings that Daniel has shared. We have asked 3 people, and I see that in the chat box not everyone can hear. I can hear you well. I think it might be only for Rory. Suleiman is also on the call, who is managing the technical side. So perhaps, Suleiman, you can help Rory with fixing the sound. To continue, we after the presentation of the findings of the academic literature review, we will have a reflection on findings where we have asked three persons to reflect from different perspectives: organizational, a project perspective, and a youth perspective, to share their thoughts on the findings, as the beginning of a broader discussion that we aim to have with you all on the findings of the report and what they mean for us in practice. And we will end with looking ahead, because this is just the first step in a longer learning trajectory, and we will look at what is going to happen in the coming weeks and months to come. If I can have the next slide, please. So very briefly, to make everyone aware of who is here today in the webinar and who is making it possible. So my name is Ronald van Moort. I work as a researcher at Oxfam Novib. And I'm involved in the Empower Youth for Work program and the Young Learning community. And I will be facilitating today this webinar. I have with me here Louise Alves. She is the intern here at Oxfam Novib, and she is a young active citizen from Brazil, and she will be supporting us today in the webinar. And also Lien van Mellaert, who is the Global Mel Lead for the Empower Youth for Work program, who will moderate the IM chat of the Skype for Webinar platform. As already said, Daniel Shepard, who has implemented the literature review, will be presenting his findings, and he will introduce himself further during the next session. And on the reflection panel, we will have Laurie Yak from Oxfam Novib. She's the program lead on youth. We will have Khalid and Jolly from Bangladesh, Oxfam in Bangladesh, and they will reflect from a program side on the findings of the literature review. And again, Louisa, who will, from a youth perspective, reflect on the findings, what she can take out of the literature review, how she recognizes herself, and what other messages she would have to our young people. And then at the very end, in the third part, we have Christina Bacalso. She works for Youth Policy Labs, and she is leading the next part of the overall learning trajectory, the next steps after this literature review, and we will reflect upon that. If I can have the next slide. So very briefly, the ways of working for this webinar. To start, for Skype for Business, we will have, and I see actually there is already some questions on that in the chat box. We have a IM chat box that we will use for technical support and technical questions. You will find the button to open this IM chat box, because it's not open by default. You will find it on the lower left corner of your webinar platform screen. It's a little box, a little circle with a box inside. If you click on it, then you will open the chat box and you will be able to state any concerns, specifically of a technical nature, and we will try to resolve it for you. We make use, in terms of Q&A and discussion, of a Google document. As you will have noted, everyone is muted by default. This will not change during the session. We will keep everyone in general on mute. And we ask you to use this Google Doc. Liam, if you can please share the link in the chat box, you will find it now. We ask you to open that Google Doc and share your questions and your discussions inside this Google Doc. Okay. To use this Google Doc to state your input on the webinar, specifically on the Q&A session and the discussion, and we will ask you to take a look at the Google Doc when the time is there. But please already feel free to open the Google document and start exploring it a bit, and then after the presentation and after the reflection session, we will ask you 2 times to share your input through this Google Doc, and we will then communicate this input to the various presenters to make sure that all your various questions and inputs and thoughts are taken into account. Just reiterate, we're all on mute. This will not change unless time, hopefully, perhaps allows that during the reflection session we can have a bit more people than those who will present and share the reflections to make a bit of a broad discussion, but we will see how the time will allow this. If I can have the next slide, please. So very briefly to introduce the 2 Oxfam entities, if you will, that make today possible. So first off, it's part of the Empower Youth for Work program. It's a 5-year program implemented by Oxfam partners in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Pakistan. And we work with young people to increase resilience, agency, economic opportunities, and rights of young people, especially young women in rural areas that are affected by climate change. And the ultimate goal is that we aim to ensure a sustainable and fair and decent work and income for young people. And we work with through 3 main building blocks inside the Empower Youth for Work program. That is on agency and skills. Second one is economic opportunities, and third one is enabling environment. And through working on all those 3 building blocks, we hope to achieve our ultimate goal. If I can have the next slide. And also the YUC learning community. And the YUC learning community is part of the Knowledge of Governance and Citizenship. And the aim with the community is to enable Oxfam partners and young people to develop their knowledge and practices in the field of youth active citizenship. And we aim to connect, share and learn, and support and facilitate to make sure that we really create that community of practice inside Oxfam for those who work on the topic and those who are interested in it, and link up with partner organizations and, of course, our youth allies in the countries we work. And we have a current learning agenda that focuses, amongst others, on youth as active citizens and governance and political participation. And of course, youth influencing policy is an integral aspect that we will take a look at in this learning agenda. If I can have the next slide. And just very briefly to get it clear about why we have conducted the literature review. It is part of a broader learning trajectory on youth policy influencing. Youth policy influencing has been identified by the Empower Youth Work program and the YUC learning community as one of the areas we need more learning and research on. And we decided, well, as a first step, let's see what is already out there. Let's conduct a literature review and then move on from that basis. Can I have the next slide? Without further ado, I would now like to ask Daniel to share his findings on his academic literature review that he has conducted. So Daniel, we will unmute you, after which you can take it away. Let's see if we can find you. Yes, let's see. Okay, you're unmuted.
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So just a little brief introduction. My name is Daniel Shepard. I'm a researcher and also a president of Implementation Science Communication Strategies Group, and we provide consulting and training on the combination of research and communication support. And so, in that capacity, I've been very happy to work on this literature review with all of you at Oxfam. So, as Ronald said, this is a starting point, and I very much look forward to seeing how all of you push forward all of our understanding of how young people influence policies. As you're probably aware, there's been previous reviews that have focused a bit more on how young people maybe have their own capacities built through being involved in policy influencing activities. But this review, as you'll see on this next slide, was focused on what's the result of that from a policy perspective. So how do young people have an influence on changing policies? Since 2000, so that we can make sure that the findings are as applicable as possible. And it also narrowed the focus to, let's say, so-called developing countries. So these are any countries that are not in the top 50 in terms of their Human Development Index. A lot of the literature and reviews previously have focused a bit more on maybe United States and Eurocentric kind of reviews. So we wanted to expand that. And then finally, we focused on sort of larger scale policies. So this was not focused on the influence that young people have on particular projects, but rather the influence they have on entire organizational strategies or local government or national government or international government and so on. So the approach, yeah, you can go ahead to the next slide. So from a methodological standpoint, the approach focused on what some people might call kind of a mini systematic review. So basically it meant we decided beforehand where to look for research, for academic papers on the topic of youth influencing policy to make sure we had a broad swath, a broad selection of the papers that are essentially representative. So this is the idea of the databases that we looked at. They comprise millions of records, academic paper records, as you can see. We then used a kind of pre-selected search term, for example, different words for youth, teenage, young people, and so on, combined with different words for policy influencing, policy, influence, advocacy, and so on. And that structured search, then in the future, people could replicate it. So we wanted to be transparent. That search resulted in a few thousand different papers that may be relevant. Just very quickly then kind of scan through those to see which ones are actually about young people and not just written by someone whose name happened to be young, for example. And that screening process resulted in 37 cases and 36 sort of theory-based papers. And you might be shocked to see this move from millions to thousands to dozens, but that's quite common in these sort of reviews because once you get down to a specific question, it focuses the literature very quickly. So we can go to the next slide. So the rest of this will be sort of summarizing what that literature says. So what the literature that's been published in more academic circles, as well as in some organizational websites, what sort of context it's in, and what are the sort of trends and strategies that we're seeing in how young people are influencing those higher level policies. So this next slide provides a geographic view of where the cases are from. As you can see, it's fairly broad. It's across several continents with perhaps a slightly higher concentration in South Asia and Africa. You can't see it well on the map, but there are also cases from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Tajikistan and Kosovo, for example. The cases are mostly mixed in nature as far as the gender mix, right? So there's both young men and young women involved. There are a few cases each of young people where only young women are trying to influence policy, or only young men, so roughly 10% each. And you'll see as well that when looking geographically, There's a larger number of cases from urban areas than from rural areas. And again, the majority are from a mix. So you can imagine, influencing perhaps a large municipality or influencing a region, which would obviously cover both rural and urban areas, or indeed national policy, which would cover both rural and urban policies. And then a few where the case just was not exactly clear of the geography and so forth. So the final thing, just that last little graph there, is just to say that these efforts happen with individual young people influencing policies all the way up to very large movements. So yes, we can go to the next slide. So the first broad trend that came out in literature review, which is quite interesting, is that kind of in line with perhaps the movement towards greater participation of young people, there's been an increase over the past 2 decades in the number of cases in which young people are the driving force behind the policy influencing initiatives. Now, what I mean by that is that in more recent years, it's more likely that the young people run the entire organization that's taking part in advocacy. It's also more likely that young people themselves are choosing the policy to influence or choosing the method to use to influence. Whereas, as you can see in that sort of bar graph on the sort of left side, of the bar graph up to the first peak. There's more light colors, right? And those are projects that are kind of initiated by development organizations that are essentially adult-led. And although youth are very involved, they might not be the ones that decided what the policy was to be targeted and how and so forth. So there's this shift towards youth being more in the lead. And there's also, interestingly, there seems to be greater impact from these initiatives, right? So when I say greater impact on policy, I mean that from a sort of qualitative standpoint, it seems like the policy shifted, more quickly and seemed to be more connected to the effort. But it's worth saying that the literature on how effective these approaches are is not as strong as one would like. Often it's kind of just assumed that the influence was caused by the efforts. So it'd be interesting with all of your work, as you continue to push the frontier on this, to have kind of better analysis, maybe more in-depth qualitative analysis about how young people have that impact. But nonetheless, there does seem to be a stronger impact of these youth-led initiatives. And one other factor with the youth-led initiatives is that it seems to be more motivating for young people. So you'll find in the literature, perhaps in cases where organizations are more in the lead, young people might feel that decisions are really being made behind closed doors, and might feel less kind of enthusiasm after seeing the results, because they perhaps feel like they were not in the driver's seat. And now lastly, just because young people are leading an effort, right, doesn't mean there's not power dynamics, right? Obviously, whenever there's the youth involved with an development organization, there might be power dynamics because of funding streams, where the organization is kind of unintentionally putting pressure on the youth to act in a certain way. But also when even youth are working amongst themselves, what's mentioned in the literature is that you still have some of the kind of common traditional power dynamics, which we might hope to reduce. So for example, young men might be more likely to be in leadership roles than young women. Older youth might have more power and say than younger youth within a youth-led initiative, and perhaps more educated young people might have more say so. And obviously at times there's definitely a role to be played by kind of experience and knowledge, but it's something to be cognizant about to make sure that efforts, whether they're with organizations or whether they're driven by youth themselves, are indeed representative of the large diversity among the population and among young people. So that's the first trend, this trend towards greater youth leadership, which is also seeming to have a bit more impact on policies. The second trend, broadly speaking, is this move towards a more local focus, or at least a greater balance between national influencing and local influencing. So you'll see kind of again, looking at this bar graph, that on the left side, there's perhaps slightly more of the darker blue. That's the sort of national cases of influencing national policies. And then on the right side, you'll see a lot more of the light blue. And these are cases of influencing local policies or community policies, and sometimes large organizations as well. And similar to the previous trend of a greater youth focus, this greater local focus seems to show a little bit more impact, especially on implementation. Perhaps not surprising, because if you're a young person or any person influencing a policy that's near you, you can show up, you have more in common with those people. You can keep an eye on how things are actually being implemented. Is the road being built? Is the school being built and staffed, and so forth? So there's a particular impact here on how policies are actually being translated into action. And again, kind of similar to the trend towards greater youth leadership, with this second trend towards a more local focus, or more balanced focus between local and national, it seems to also have a motivating effect, right? You can see the impact a bit more quickly. And then the final note here is, this is not to say that give up on national influencing or give up on international influencing, but rather that both are very important, and perhaps local is a good entry point for future national influencing. And perhaps the best way to think of it is in terms of a common concept in policy influencing of venue shopping. So kind of sounds straightforward when you think about it, but it's basically this concept that both vertically, if you're looking at national or regional, local, organizational, but also horizontally, if you're looking at implementers versus the legal system versus private sector, to look at what venue is most accessible for you to influence the policy, what venue and what crowd is most favorable, kind of your potential allies, and also which one is currently talking about the issue of interest. So if you want to influence minimum wage policy, for example, perhaps that's being discussed at a local level, not a national level. Therefore, local is a good entry point. Or the inverse, right? Perhaps there's really big national movement, and it's worthwhile tapping into that. So it's worth thinking, through the sequence, but also thinking through how to balance the different venues that are being targeted. So those are the two broad trends. One is a more youth-led focus, and second is more local focus. And then if we can go to the next slide. So the next part of the review is looking at how could we group some of these strategies that are being used across cases and being used by young people. So I imagine most of these strategies will not be surprising at all to folks, but it's kind of useful to think about perhaps which one is most applicable in your context and which combination is most effective. So the 6 week that were used to group them are, one is obviously young people can be directly involved in governance, right? They can run for office, run for school board, run for city council. The interesting thing to think about here is in your context, what are the age cutoffs? And there are cases in the review that we identified where one of the policies that was being influenced was reducing that age cutoff to sit on a land board, for example, for agricultural policy. So direct governance is one strategy. A second broad set of strategies is kind of these large-scale policy influencing protests or strikes from work to influence labor policy, right, and improve working conditions. So this is, perhaps examples that are really top of mind for folks of cases from the Arab Spring or cases whenever you see, Occupy Wall Street or large groups of young people out demanding change. The third is sort of youth parliaments, youth boards, youth councils, so youth-only decision-making bodies. And it's worth saying that these are often more symbolic. So they're sort of organized to raise awareness or to make recommendations to the, quote, real decision makers. And there's a question here we're thinking about, which is different authors have argued that these sorts of youth councils should actually have more real power, because sometimes they seem very tokenistic. and they should also be allowed to speak to more than just, quote, youth policies, right? Because obviously young people are affected by everything: health policy, employment policy, educational policy. So it's worth thinking about other policies and not just delegating perhaps, the youth policy and sexual reproductive rights to be discussed, for example. The fourth sort of category is essentially looking at methods to raise awareness and knowledge about perhaps problems with the system or needs that need to be addressed through social audits and research that is led by young people. So these, an interesting example here would be where young people conducted a social audit and discovered that a school had not been built safely, brought that to the attention of the local council, which then allocated funds to repair the school. So this tends to be either focused on implementation issues or focused on raising awareness of a need, right? Such as there's a large number of young people who lack an ID and therefore cannot access school, and young people raise awareness of this and say, okay, we need better ID policies or allow people to go to school without an ID. So that's audits and research. The fifth is this interesting concept that has resurfaced some in youth policy influencing literature. It comes a bit kind of historically from some feminist literature and others, and that's this idea of prefigurative politics, which is essentially a fancy way of saying be the change you want to see and use that as pressure. Right. So an example of this would be if young people see a need for a policy, rather than asking decision makers to do it, perhaps they start doing it themselves, which brings media attention, puts pressure on decision makers, and shows the need for that change. An example here is where young people started building a road, and they didn't have enough resources to finish it, but it essentially shamed the local council to finish building that road. The sixth is, I think of these as sort of very supportive types of mechanisms. So that's the use of media, the use of art, the use of technology, often to support some of the other methods. So you can imagine, using radio or using edutainment to raise awareness for an issue. You can imagine, in some of the cases, young people using Facebook to help organize a protest, or using SMS to help coordinate amongst different activities, or using technology to help collect data during research, and so on. So these are sometimes very useful methods that are used to help increase motivation and engagement of young participants, but also increase the salience and the power of the policy influencing, right? By making it visual, by making it engaging, and so forth. So these are sort of 6 broad strategies that were identified in the literature, and obviously there are others, and in many cases they're combined. And so I think this is a nice starting point to think about which one or which ones might be most useful in a particular context. If we can go to the next slide. So to sort of wrap this up, one other question that we address is, what can development organizations like Oxfam, like Oxfam's partners, do to support youth policy influencing, especially if there is this trend towards, and sort of a support of this trend towards greater youth leadership? So one way to support is to build connections. Several of the cases identified when different youth initiatives were not coordinated. You could imagine, an NGO or a civil society organization helping them coordinate with each other and amplify their voice, but also sometimes opening up those doors to policymakers. Because of the kind of power differential, it's possible that development organizations have the phone number, the email, the address of a policymaker that maybe the youth initiative doesn't have, and being able to share that with young people so they can make those connections, and being willing to share it, right? Because it's sometimes people feel it's a bit of a risk, but in many cases it pays off. The second is capacity building, and this could be a wide range of skills that are built. But one of the kind of recurring themes is a special demand for sort of leadership capacity building, and greater interest in leadership capacity building than in others. And then the last one there is inclusion, right? So development organizations might help youth initiatives flag when there's subsets of young people that are not being included, perhaps inadvertently. So trying to see how young men and young women can have more equitable roles, perhaps flagging if youth with disability are not able to engage, and helping young people think about how they can include those other groups to be as inclusive as possible. Because we're a bit low on time, I'll go briefly through the dangers. I'm sure this will come up in the reflections. So this is just to be aware of as a large organization, or even as a smaller one, that many organizations are themselves formalized, right? But they might also have a formal bias to put pressure on young people to also formalize, and that could drain energy and attention perhaps away from the policy influencing towards more administrative efforts. And then the third point there is about again, thinking about the power imbalance when you're a source of funding, when you're a source of access. It's very easy to inadvertently push young people in a certain direction, and development organizations might perhaps be less interested in more contentious, more aggressive policy influencing that some youth might be engaged in, even when that might be the best method. So it's worth thinking about the biases that a particular development organization has, and making sure that they don't inadvertently weaken the effectiveness of youth policy influencing efforts. So again, I hope this is a good starting point, and I look forward to kind of your questions, your discussion, and I hope that it's helpful for all of you going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that very interesting presentation. And indeed, we now go into a Q&A session. So we would kindly request you again to go to the Google Doc that we have shared the link. Sorry, I was on mute. The link that we've shared just now on the IM chat box, and you will be able now to write down there any questions that you might have on the presentation to Daniel. So we will take 2 minutes now of a pause for everyone to write down their questions, after which we will continue. I will ask Daniel some of the questions, and we will reflect upon them. So we will take 2 minutes. Okay, let's continue with the session. A lot of questions already are coming in. Daniel, if you could also please have the Google Doc in front of you, then you can directly see the questions, and you are also, again, unmuted. The first two, I think, are very interesting. They go into the effectiveness of influencing strategies, the question asked by Marketa, and how potentially a contextual situation could play a role in this. And Bushra links up to that and goes a bit more in depth about protests and strikes. Perhaps Daniel, we can start with that about the effectiveness of influencing strategies. But what can you tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. So I think there's perhaps two things worth highlighting. One is that across all of them, you have examples of kind of a successful influence on policy. So, there's not one of these that never worked, and there's also not one of these that necessarily always worked. That said, one that's worth highlighting is that with protests and strikes in particular, there might be, and again, you don't want to generalize too much from a few cases, but there's sometimes a greater danger here for kind of negative reactions, especially if it's within the context of a more restrictive government regime. So there's certainly cases where young people protest or they strike, and the army or military or police use violent means to suppress it. And that doesn't mean that they didn't have an influence on the kind of public discourse, but it certainly is, a negative outcome. So I think that there's somewhat more risk with those large-scale protests in certain contexts. With model parliaments, it's also worth kind of just reiterating a bit of what it said, where these seem to be most effective whenever there's a link to other decision makers. So to give you one example, where they actually conducted the model parliament inside the actual parliament and the actual parliamentarians were present. And so it kind of had more salient effect on them, as opposed to if it's just organized within a development organization's and kind of non-formal or less formal setting. So those are a few reflections, but I guess the kind of big picture is that I wouldn't say that some are necessarily always more effective, some are less effective, but you could say that perhaps the larger scale ones, such as protests and direct governance, are most likely to have an impact on, or the first three are more likely to have an impact on national policies. Than perhaps the latter three, which tend to be more impactful when focused on local policies, broadly speaking. So I don't know if that covered all the parts of that question, but I think to also to highlight what I said at the beginning, that it's there's need for much more in-depth, like high quality qualitative work to really describe like the ins and outs of the entire process. A lot of these papers will kind of spend a few paragraphs talking about the influence, so it's not as in-depth as one would like. Bro?
Thank you for that, Daniel. This is a very interesting notion. Perhaps we can move to other linked questions. They're coming from Imogen. They talk about a bit more the risk side of NGOs supporting youth movements. So how do we balance the need for sustainability in our work? How do we support youth movements in such a way that we can ensure that they will carry on their work after NGO involvement? And also a question linked to that on the bias towards more privileged youth that NGOs often support. Perhaps you can reflect upon those two questions.
Sorry, which ones again, Ronald?
The two questions asked by Imogen.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, I mean, indeed, there's a balance to be struck here, right? So sometimes you need the kind of a quick reaction to a policy or like kind of intensive pressure on a policy that might be somewhat more informal in nature. And perhaps that's enough. And then in other times you might want something that's a bit more sustained and institutionalized. So I think to kind of perhaps add a caveat to what I said regarding formalization, it's not to say that formalization is necessarily a bad thing, but rather that it should be done very, very consciously. So for example, sometimes it might be done just because it paves the way to have an official agreement between an NGO and a youth movement. And perhaps that's not the best reason, unless indeed there's like a recognition that, okay, we want to influence X policy, the youth also want to influence that same policy, and the only way this is going to happen is over the course of the next 3 years, because that's sort of the decision-making process for changing. And so therefore we want to institutionalize. So I'd say it's more a matter of just being very making sure that it's necessary before doing it, and also being clear about what the potential loss is, right? And also just kind of, add to that. It's not necessarily the case that young people are less interested because it's more formal. I think it's more the case that when it's sometimes it's youth organizations are formalized in a manner that's perhaps more in line with what, let's say, the adults want than perhaps what the young people want. So there's been some cases where young people are involved in youth councils that were more formalized and then just eventually quit and started pressuring on policies more informally because the policies that were chosen at the youth council were kind of less of interest to their needs.
Okay, thank you for that. In terms of time management, we won't be able to engage with all the questions, unfortunately, but we will keep the Google documents, so we will have them all, and perhaps at a later stage we can engage with them beyond this webinar. But for now, Daniel, I would like to highlight two last questions that are
Mm-hmm.
interesting. They're on the third page. They're coming from the Bangladesh team. They're sitting together in a room with Oxfam and partners. So many people there have joined from that side. That's really nice. And there's a question about if young people are not in a formal structure, how can they influence policy? As some governments only recognize formal structures, and also a bit on the practical side, if young people in, for example, rural areas do not have formal education, then influencing policy, national policy, isn't that way too much ambitious? What are your thoughts on that?
So kind of going backwards. So I think that the last point about maybe in rural areas wanting to focus more on that it might be more difficult to focus on national policy. I think that's one of the driving factors behind a greater shift to local focuses. I mean, indeed, there's been a lot of decentralization of governments for that reason, right? The idea is that when you decentralize, those that might live in other areas that are far away from the capital can still have influence. So I think that you're right that especially in certain contexts, especially the rural context, it might be easier to influence the local policy. And then indeed, if there's a national policy that wants to be targeted, again, thinking about how to make that connection. So maybe connecting particular rural initiatives with some more national entity. And regarding kind of the recognition of formal or informal groups, I mean, I think it's not necessarily the case that informal or formal groups have more policy influence. Even if a government doesn't recognize an informal group, it can raise awareness, it can put pressure by, you know, if you're doing a strike, even informally, it can put pressure on decision makers to act. So it's not necessarily the case that you need a formal institution to influence the government, even if the government doesn't want to be influenced. But with that said, it is true that, like, if you want to be, for example, sitting on a strategic board of some sort, or some sort of entity that the government sets up, they might only recognize formal institutions. In which case, I mean, that's kind of an interesting opportunity for more formal organizations to perhaps be the voice or be the conduit for more informal organizations, even if they do so ineffectively. And to kind of add to that, to give you one example, one of the cases was discussing in Egypt where it was very difficult for civil society organizations to be officially and formally registered and recognized. And for that reason, there's kind of like an explosion in informal organizations to influence policies and different, which then obviously was part of this whole context of regime change within Egypt. So it's a bit of a unique situation. So I think it's it's an interesting question to think about the context, in context where there's less support for kind of contentious formalized NGOs, right? Thinking places like maybe Russia, maybe Egypt, and others. That also might be an opportunity to identify informal groups, and for entities like Oxfam and others to be the conduit for those voices.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing the presentation and engaging a few of the questions that have been also been very insightful. For time management, we need to move on now, but we will keep the Google document and perhaps we can engage with the questions beyond the webinar. So I would like to move on now to the next part of the webinar, reflection time, if you will. We have asked four colleagues, to have a reflection on the findings. I would like to start with Oloriak, if I can have the next slide. Or sorry, perhaps first to explain, we will have that reflection from various perspectives. We will have three perspectives to reflect from an organizational side. So how can we place Oxfam in the findings recommendations? From a program perspective, looking at the trends and the groups of strategies, what does that tell us? How can we take that up in our programs? And from a youth perspective, how does it reflect a young person's own experiences and what their message be to other influencers? So I'd like to move now to the next slide and go to the first perspective, organizational perspective, which will be taken up by Oloriak. Oloriak, we've just unmuted you, so please take it away.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So when I was reflecting on this question in our current situation, I was thinking, yeah, the good, the bad, the ugly. You know, I think we have cases of everything. In regards to some of the good cases I've seen of where youth have been able to influence and really been part of the kind of been leading, like where we have really kind of promoted that leading. I think My Rights, My Voice has some really good examples. But structurally, I think the challenge for that project and that program to start off was really for staff to understand how that mind shift to really working with youth instead of for youth and what that would mean. And I think that mind shift is so important in any kind of program that is working with youth, and really having that discussion with partners, with staff about what that means. You know, when you are delivering a project for youth, it is very different when you are trying to promote youth to make that change. And it sounds simple, but it's actually, I think, far more complicated than we allow space for that. And so, and kind of having more structurally youth being more involved in the planning and implementation of programs. And I think it also has a lot to do with kind of the inspired country directors and kind of program leads to really promote this. And there are some really good examples, for example, in Senegal and Tunisia of trying to support youth movements. So in Tunisia, that involved capacity building. And in Senegal, with a movement called Yen and Mar, actually I saw a lot of what Daniel was talking about in that example, because Oxfam, in order to fund this youth movement, asked them to become more formalized. And in a discussion I had with them a couple years ago, they talked about the struggle of becoming, of going from a youth movement to really a formalized NGO in order to be funded. And there was definitely advantages and disadvantages to that. And the people that were really involved in the youth movement didn't have the practical experience to run an NGO. And they had to, it was really a challenging process. So in terms of the recommendations to us, I think, so facilitating connections, I think that's important for Oxfam, and I think we're very well placed to do this. And I think what Daniel said is a good point about how, having staff being willing to do this is really important. In terms of building capacity, as I said, like the Tunisia example, there's a good example in Tunisia where, as the Oxfam office was able to support a youth organization, and really give them skills in order to improve their organization for them to be more effective. And I think this is a really good example of how to use what we have in order to help them. And then inclusion of underrepresented groups, very important and incredibly challenging, and I think needs to be more of a priority. I think what came out of My Rights, My Voice program was really a clear need to define what we mean by marginalized groups and really have an understanding of who we're trying to target. And then lastly, ways forward. In terms, I think it's important for each one of us to, as the staff of Oxfam and also for our partners, to really promote the learning and help really changing how we design and implement our projects. I think it's important that we lobby internally to have mechanisms to support youth organizations. For example, funding youth organizations can be very challenging when that organization doesn't meet our audit standards. This is a real challenge to try to figure out how we can support organizations and still respond to our donors. And I think that's really about finding like-minded donors that really want to think outside the box on how we can do that. Yeah, so that's pretty much from my side.
Okay, thank you so much, Gloria. Really interesting reflection about reality also within Oxfam. We have again muted you, and I would like to remind everyone again of the Google Doc. On page 4 in the Google Doc, you will see the page on part 2, discussion on findings. If during the reflections that are happening now, if you have any input from yourself or perhaps questions, please write them down, and if time allows, we will go into them afterwards. We move now towards the next perspective. It's a program perspective, and we ask Khalid and Jolly and all the various colleagues and partners that are together with them in the room in Bangladesh to reflect from a program perspective in 5 to 7 minutes about what we can, for example, in Empower Youth Work program now do with this knowledge we have gained. It might be because they're in the field, so it might be that the connection is a bit tricky. So we will try to make it work. We will unmute you now, Khalid, and let's see if it works, and otherwise how we can solve it. So we will unmute you now.
Can you hear me, Ronald?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. So luckily we are having a good connection here, and we just opened the window, door, everything, so that we can get a good connection here. And I think Jolly is not in the line. I haven't seen her. So the thing is that just this morning we finished one inception meeting of our Empower Youth Work project in a rural town in Bangladesh. So that's why I'm with the partners. So they are basically implementing the project, and I'm very lucky that they are with me. And the democratic movement in Bangladesh, or the movement for our independence, it was youth-led. But the challenge nowadays, it's the issue, like what is the issue which can glue young people together so that they have some kind of words at the policy influencing level. So basically, that's why at the programmatic level, we are searching for that narrative which would attract young people to work together. So basically, we are talking about economic opportunity and investment from the government on them. So we think that that is the issue which can bring them together. If we can create that kind of value that it is their right to have economic opportunity and government must invest on them, then that level of movement would be possible. And then another from the research which is really important, it is also like one of the partner staff who raised the question, like many of the young people, they are not educated. So how can they influence national level policy making process? So basically, there we also think that in all cases, we should not focus on national level changes. If we are too much concerned about that, we would be frustrated if we don't consider the reality. So there must be a fair mix there, and we should have youth representation and youth-led initiatives at different level. So from the local level, we also have experiences that, like, if we can have a number of good examples at local level, and that would also have some kind of impact at the national level. So we can also establish that kind of local to national link by creating impacts at local level, which would have implications at national level if we can have many of those examples. So that's why I think this project in the Youth Empower Youth for Work project, we would try to do that from programmatic perspective. And another one from the programmatic perspective, we also think that the formal there should be a mix of formal and informal structure. Like, we should not just think about formal or just informal. There must be something in between. That's why, like, the youth groups we are talking about at the lowest unit, like at the village level or the ward level, we say in Bangladesh. So if youth groups, they are formed from that level, if it is led by them, they can remain informal, but when they would go to district level or at national level, there should be some kind of formal structure. So from a programmatic perspective, we think that there must be a mix of that structure. And also another important perspective from the research regarding the strategies. If we think or look at the strategies, it's like we have two different ends, like non-violent kind of act related to media using ICT. Then we also, I would not say like violent, but it may become violent sometimes, like when we talk about protest and strikes, and we know that considering the shrinking civil society space, that is a bit tricky, like if we consider those kind of strategies. So, but those things are also important. So there we must be innovative. We know that young people, they are very innovative in terms of organizing, like protest or strikes, but that have huge media coverage and impact. So we can focus on that area, and obviously, like media, ICT use. Young people are nowadays, they are using those means very much, and from project perspective, we would focus on those things. And also in Bangladesh, we're talking about developing youth reporters at the grassroots level by linking them with media people so that they can bring their stories from the ground and they can report on that. And from the research, one important thing from the influencing perspective, what I have found that one important influencing strategy is lobby. And young people, it is also evident from the research that they are not doing a lot of lobbying. And over the years, we have the experience that many of the policy changes happened due to strong lobby works, not through popular mobilization or other means. So how young people can be involved in lobbying. So from project perspective, it is also take away from our side that we need to build their capacity on lobbying, how they can lobby the policy makers or the government officials. There, as the research is talking about connections, inclusion, there we need to connect the young people with the policy makers or the government officials or private sector. We need to do those kind of things. We need to build their capacity on lobbying, and obviously inclusion is very important because everyone has their social capital. They have influences in different tiers. So how we can include everyone so that in terms of social capital, we are also having a diverse group within ourselves. So those are the things from my side, from project perspective. I'm not that structured, but those are the perspectives I had from program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Khalid. And the connection was luckily perfectly clear. So we were really blessed today with with a good connection. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts. So we move now to the final perspective, the youth perspective. If we can go to the next slide, and that final perspective will be given by Louise Alves. I'm not sure if the slide is already changing, and I guess she. But let's start, and we fix in the meanwhile the slides. But let's start now with the reflection from Louise.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. I don't know if you're listening. I'm not talking through my username. I'm talking through Ronald's. So if you're confused, I'm the Ronald square in the in the screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience as a young person, as a counselor in a youth council in Brazil, and talk about the obstacles I've faced as a young counselor in the council. So the councils in Brazil, like the youth councils in Brazil, works in 3 different levels: the city level, the state level, and the national level. I used to be a counselor in the state level, in the state of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, but we also have the national and the city level. Sorry. So the council is basically divided between civil society and members of the government. Among the civil society members, there we have the different NGOs, social movements, and mostly young people that are part of political parties. And from the other side, they choose, they have to give a seat from each secretary of inside the government, like so health, education, security, different secretaries of different topics. They have one seat in the council. So what happens is, like, when we first started the council, we were like young people, very energetic to participate, and the civil society had a huge participation on it, while the government side was not attending to the meetings because mostly they have an obligation to be there. They're not there because they want to influence public policy. So as young people, and part of the civil society, we had to map all the public policies in Rio de Janeiro and try to influence the public policy, the policy design in the state. But what we faced was a lot of obstacles, mostly because they changed the government since we chose the president for the council, and afterwards they changed the government. So changing the government changed everything. They fired a lot of people inside the government, so we had to reselect all the seats inside the council and to reselect the president, and that takes months. They fire people mostly because of political for political reasons. Like if they're not the party of the new governor, they have to be fired. So this steps a lot. It's jeopardize all our work as a council. Another main obstacle was the lack of respect to diversity, mostly because we have seats of LGBT community, and in most of the reunions they used to call, we had a transgender woman and they used to call her him and call the birth name. So it seems like something simple, but it actually jeopardized all our meetings because we had to stop and ask them, like, can you please call her the name that she wants to be called. The other obstacle is the lack of financial support. Since it's a state level council, we had councilors from different cities in the state, and the state it's a really big state. You can take like even 5 hours from one city to the capital. So a lot of counselors from the countryside couldn't attend to the meetings because the government used to take too long to give the budget, or not giving at all. So they couldn't attend to the meetings and therefore not participate. Also, the bureaucracy, the long meetings, and the very formal side of it. And what I understood from my experience in relating to what Daniel Shepard was saying, the tendency of the effectiveness of the council is most if you see the national level and you go to the city level is much more effective, because like the more local you go, the easiest, less bureaucracy you have, and easiest it's easier to effectively influence the policymakers. And also anyways, the government isn't supporting the youth initiatives by giving different movements like the seats in the council, although they also pick certain NGOs or movements because they have interested in those people to be represented. So through according to this experience, like the question that I want to put here for you is to see like how much effective can political participation for young people can be. Okay, in this case, young people are participating, but to which extent is this really influencing public policy? So that's a question I want to leave for you, and maybe we can try to debate in the Q&A session afterwards.
Okay, thank you so much, Louise. It was a really interesting reflection, and I think indeed it's one of the key questions that you end with, that we should ask ourselves when is it becoming really no longer simply participating, but really influencing policy and decision making. So thank you so much for that. I see that the Google Doc is really actively used. There's really a discussion going on the Google Doc. It's really nice to see. In terms of time, we're really a bit short of time. So what I would like to propose is that we, for now, postpone further the discussion, and first move towards the third part and final part of the webinar. And if time allows, after that we can still take then up the discussion, and otherwise, again, we will keep the Google Doc, make it a bit nicer, of course, and share with everyone, so we won't lose any input or any questions asked. So moving ahead now to the third part, that is all about looking ahead. As we said, it's the literature review. It's the first step in a longer learning and research trajectory. And the next step that will be taken, we are working together with Youth Policy Labs, and today we have Christina Bacalzo with us from Youth Policy Labs, who will talk a bit more about what their plans are during the coming weeks, and also we will engage in an interactive session in which we will vote on a few key questions that will guide the work of Youth Policy Labs. Christina, we are unmuting you now, so please, whenever you're ready.
Great. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Christina Bacalzo. I am the research coordinator from Youth Policy Labs. Youth Policy Labs, just briefly, is a youth-focused think tank, which is based out of Berlin, Germany. And our research focuses primarily on youth policies, but also including themes such as youth participation. And we conduct original research, both at kind of international framework levels as well as regional and national levels, and in addition provide technical assistance in the form of research projects to feed into advising programs and policies, as well as facilitating youth consultations for the purposes, again, of formulating policies and programs. As far as the second part of the literature review, which we are leading, we are going to be following on the academic literature review presented by Daniel, and then shift the focus to have more of a practitioner focus. So in doing this, we essentially are looking at the similar research questions as Daniel had, but with a slight shift. So for example, our research questions are then, what are the latest frameworks and approaches used by the development community to support young people influencing public policy? What are the change strategies employed by young people to influence public policy, and why have they been adopted? What are notable examples of youth initiatives that aim to influence policy, and how have they contributed to change? And lastly, how have the frameworks and approaches used by the development community supported or hampered youth initiatives to influence public policy? So as you can see, the research questions which we are looking at are very similar to Daniel's, but meant to be more to build on top of his existing research and look more at the frameworks and the initiatives that are used by NGOs and INGOs, and the ways that they interact with current examples of youth-led initiatives. So to do this, our report will have 3 sections. The first will be trends and overview of practitioner approaches supporting youth-led initiatives, and this is really looking at what are different NGOs, INGOs, perhaps even in the donor community, what are their approaches in general to youth participation, but more in specific the types of initiatives that they are using to support youth-led initiatives in influencing policy. And we are going to be identifying a few which in particular give young people the freest range to be in control and to lead initiatives, and what are those defining characteristics. Of course, we are going to be ideally reaching out to some people from these organizations that we will identify either at the international, national, or local level, and also, to have a little bit of kind of verbatim reflections from them in terms of what is working for them and how do they use this approach, as well as looking at perhaps examples of obstruction, so to also then reflect where are, have we seen evidence maybe of where some of these practitioners have failed or actually have instead obstructed youth-led initiatives. The second part of our, the second section of our report is then actually looking at a profile of 5 youth initiatives. And for that, we are going to be looking at various participation spaces in which these initiatives may be existing. And so these participations include formal participation by invitation, formal participation by right, created by non-state institutions, so that can include political parties or religious institutions, created by civil society organizations, or collective transitory actions, so perhaps more kind of grassroots level formations and movements. And the idea of looking at this range of participation spaces is very similar to sort of what Daniel was speaking to in terms of, looking at the kind of different array of formality versus, for example, youth councils versus more spontaneous protest action versus groups which are perhaps related to political parties and this kind of thing, to sort of understand, the various spaces in which young people are self-organizing. Of course, in consideration to special attention with rural focus as well as gender and this kind of thing. We will, of the various youth initiatives that we will seek out, we will select 5. And for each, in consideration of essentially a geographic distribution as well as a range of thematic type, again, too, with a different focus on rural, gender, perhaps different uses of ICT. And we'll provide profiles of each of these youth initiatives, which will also include reflections from some of the members or leaders of these youth initiatives, if possible, that we will try to connect with over Skype. For these youth initiatives, and I'll mention this as we come back when we do the online poll, many of you have received ideally a email survey, a very short email survey, to also get some ideas of perhaps youth initiatives in your local area that you have heard of. Of course, our work is primarily desk research, but we wanted to reach out to the Oxfam country offices as well as the partners to see, sort of with your ear to the ground, what are some exciting youth initiatives that are happening in your area that you can tell us about. So lastly, our last section is really then combining what we've learned from our review and overview of practitioner approaches, what we've learned by the profile of the 5 youth initiatives that we select, and kind of combining those two to sort of synthesize and looking at kind of overarching findings and relevance for practitioners. So again, returning back to the original research questions, looking at this sort of idea of what are the approaches and frameworks that are really enabling these youth-led initiatives, and really framing it in terms of practical implications for young people and those working with youth-led initiatives. So for you as a practitioner in your daily work at the organizational and programmatic level, what are the implications of this research for you? So again, these are sort of our overall 3 sections here. What we wanted to move to is a kind of short 3-part survey or poll that we're actually going to do in the webinar itself. Perhaps I'll hand it off to Ronald if you wanted to maybe facilitate a bit of how participants can do this.
Sure, no worries. So we're moving to the poll now. We have 3 multiple choice questions, which we will start showing instead of the PowerPoint. So you will see on your screen instead of the PowerPoint a multiple choice question, and we ask of you to select the answer that is of most relevance to you. You can select only one answer. And there are 2 notes on that. If you feel like that the choices you have, and you will see here now already the first question on your screen. So you'll see 4 choices. You can vote for one of these choices, but note if you don't feel comfortable with these choices, and actually you would like to choose something else, then we refer you again back to the Google Doc, and on page 6, you will find a table in which all 3 questions are there. And if in case you want to provide a different answer than actually the 4 answers provided, you can simply refrain from selecting one of the 4 in the webinar platform and write down your alternative answer in the Google Doc. And in case if the questions are not showing for you, what I will do is I will read out the answers, and if you are not able to see them or select them, simply fill in the most relevant answer that you've heard in the Google Doc, or as we discussed, alternatively your own answer. You will find in any case all questions in Google Doc, the formulation of all questions. So let's move now to the first question. So it's about which characteristic do you think is most important for a youth initiative to be notable? Already people are starting to vote. For those who cannot see the answers, let me read it out to you. So the first answer is, it is a very youth-led, with little adult support or guidance. That could be the first option. The second option is, they appear to be very active, for example, very visible in local or national media. And the third one, they seem to be effective in influencing policy and politics. And the fourth one, they are very large, mobilizing lots of young people. So we ask of you now to vote for one of the options, either by clicking on them in the Skype for Business app or using the Google Doc.
And just to add on this question, and just to give a bit of background for this poll, it's meant to help give us some indication of perhaps what is most interesting to you as our kind of primary audience for this research, as well as what may be most relevant to your work. Of course, as a caveat for this note on effectiveness, Daniel had spoken to that a bit earlier. This idea of being able to attribute effectiveness to any one movement or youth-led initiative, of course, will be difficult, but we will try, ideally, through these conversations, particularly with the young people themselves, to get a sense of perhaps how they see their own effectiveness in this in these kind of policy and political processes.
Okay, thank you so much for that further explanation. Really good background indeed to be more aware of why indeed we're doing this. For those who've missed the options, we're typing them now also in the chat box, so you can see them there. And also, if you do not see it in the Skype webinar app and you also don't have access to the Google Doc, please write them in the chat box then, your answer, and we will make sure to take all the various avenues in which answers come in. We will all take them into account. So we'll take 1 more minute to allow everyone to vote. So let's move to the next question. A lot of people have already voted. I see the votes coming in. Also, the Google Doc is actively used. So for sake of time, let's move to the next question. So we're bringing it up the screen now. Let's see if it's coming up. It's a bit tricky. So this is the second question, and perhaps Christina, you would like to give a very short background on that question.
She's muted.
Great. So again, this is getting to this idea of once we have identified what we kind of consider a youth initiative to be notable, so what are the characteristics of a notable youth initiative? We also wanted to get a sense of the profiles that we are then going to be providing. What is most interesting to you as the practitioner or as the reader of our report? Is it learning or understanding more about how young people were motivated to start the initiative in the first place? Is it how the initiative itself organizes internally? So for example, how does it make its decisions? How does it select its leadership, its governance structure? Is it perhaps the change strategies used by young people to try and influence policy? So for example, the use of protesting or letter writing, or is it what youth initiatives see as their successes and challenges? Just to note that we recognize that sort of all of these aspects are important, and we will, as much as possible within the limited word limit that we have, to try to touch on at least all of these in some respect. But it would be interesting for us to know if there is one area which is most useful or most interesting to people for us to really be able to put an emphasis on.
Okay, thank you so much, Magali. Sorry, Christina. Sorry, I'm reading the comment section. Thank you so much, Christina. So we now take a moment to vote for this question: what aspect about the way a notable youth initiative operates is the most interesting to you? So the first one is how the young people are motivated to start the initiative in the first place. Second one, how the initiative organizes itself internally, for example, governance structure, leadership, decision-making processes. The third one, the change strategies used by young people to try and influence policy, for example, protesting, letter writing. And the fourth one, what youth initiatives see as their successes or challenges. options, please select one, write your selection in the Google Doc, and alternatively, if you have other thoughts, write your other thoughts in the Google Doc. And also the chat box is possible. Okay, votes start to come in. So we'll take a few more seconds. And indeed, it's not easy to select only one, but note it's of course meant to give a bit more guidance where we should focus specifically on. It does not mean that the other factors will not be taken into account, but a bit more to give your own insight about what is most interesting. It's a bit difficult to choose only one, but and let's move on to then the final question now. So we are again bringing up now the final and last question. Christina, please take it away in terms of explaining the background. Oh, we will unmute. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. So lastly, this last question is really about understanding how we put here INGOs, but really it's INGOs, NGOs, and other organizations, how they support youth-led initiatives. And so this is, from your point of view, what do you think would be the most valuable for you to know about? Is it, for example, how youth-led initiatives found out about NGO support, so kind of word of mouth or flyers, the dissemination strategy? Is it the ways in which NGOs provide support, so funding, in-kind gifts, training, perhaps providing a platform for exposure? Is it how INGOs select the youth initiatives that they support? So again, keeping in mind that we will have an opportunity to speak to 2 or 3 of some of these practitioners who are utilizing these different initiatives or frameworks. Or lastly, the way that youth initiatives view INGO support. So again, this is a big part of the research overall, but just to sort of understand from your point of view as being somebody in an INGO, what is the most interesting or valuable for you to know about?
Thank you so much for that explanation. So again, we will take a moment to vote. We'll find the answers again in the chat box. You'll be able to select one or write down your alternative answer in the Google Doc, or if you can't select, write it down in the Google Doc or in the chat box. So let me one more time repeat the answers. First one, how youth-led initiatives find out about NGO support, for example, website, flyers, word of mouth. Second one, the way INGOs provide support, for example, funding, in-kind gifts, training, exposure. And the third one, how INGOs select the youth-led initiatives that they support. And the fourth and final one, the way youth initiatives view INGO support, positively or negatively. And we will take 1 minute for everyone to vote. Okay, I see a lot of votes coming in on Google Doc, chat box, and in the selection. Thank you so much all for that. So let's also now close this question. And also at the same time, looking at the time, we're immediately actually at the end of our webinar. There is unfortunately no more time left to engage in any discussion. But what we will do is keep the Google Doc open for the rest of this day. So if you have any other reflections, you can still access the doc and type it in. And we will explore with the various presenters and reflection panel how we can still engage with those questions that we have not engaged with yet. And we will share the final version of the Google Doc once we also share the recording of the webinar, so keep an eye out on that. I see one question in the chat box about Daniel's report, and indeed that is also going to be shared immediately when we will share the recording of this webinar. So we will send around the policy, a 2-page on the main findings. And the full literature review report as written by Daniel Shepard. So it will be made available at the same time that we will share the webinar recording. So for now, I would like to thank everyone who participated in the webinar, and of course specifically Daniel Shepard for presenting his findings and answering our questions, the reflection panel members who have shared their reflections and gave some very interesting insights, and of course Christina for joining us to look ahead about what we're going to do in the future, and of course looking for your insights through the polling system. We hope you all enjoyed it. And that you had some positive experience with Skype for Business. It's one of the first times we're using this, so if you have any technical feedback also for us, feel free to share, and we will make sure to communicate that to the ICT department. And I would also like to thank Suleiman for being present here today from ICT side to provide us with much needed support at some time. Thank you so much, everyone. We will now close the session, and thank you, everyone, for participating, and a special thanks for all who have presented. Thank you so much.